So, without further ado, here's retired Lieutenant Navy Peter Ward, who will tell us why and how he got involved in saving Haida. Peter?
Thank you very much, Ray. And, and thank you for the kind introduction. It was pretty long. I didn't realize I was that old. And, you talked about cancer. The worst of the cancers was cancer of the tongue. And they took out 45% of my tongue and replaced it with a piece of my left wrist. I'm hoping that that gives me license to talk off the cuff. Anyway, it's really an honor for me to be here with you this evening with such distinguished guests. I really have a soft spot for the Navy, and I always have. Getting involved with HMCS Haida was like meeting the love of your life for the first time. It brought many things into focus for me. My involvement in the story of how and why HMCS Haida was saved begins with her sister ship Athabascan and what happened to her during the Second World War. So please indulge me for a few moments as I talk a bit about Athabascan. She is my why I got involved. Athabascan and Haida were in company that fateful night of April the 28th, 29th, 1944. They had engaged with two German Elbe-class destroyers about 6 miles off the Breton coast in northwestern France. That's when Athabascan was sunk by enemy fire. In 1984, I commissioned this painting of Athabascan and Haida in action, and it hangs in my dining room. It reminds me of the events that changed my young life forever. So, by the way, there's this picture of my dad. It also hangs in the dining room. I was 13 when Dad was killed, and I virtually worshipped him. He was a loving father. The loss was devastating for our family. Sadly, 127 other families also lost loved ones that night, but nearly 4 dozen sailors were saved thanks to Haida, while others became POWs. Most of you will recognize this painting by William McDowell. It shows survivors from Athabascan being rescued by Haida. It was originally presented to the Bytown mess by the Naval Officers Mess in 1948. As you can appreciate, this image haunts me, and it's not in my house. What Haida CO Harry DeWolf and his crew did that night was extremely brave, and they saved many souls. When I was part of Haida Inc., I met Harry DeWolf on a couple of occasions after he had retired as a commander of the Canadian Navy. I even interviewed him in the late 70s for that series, Seasoned Sailors, with naval historian Michael Whitby. The year after my dad died, I went to Lakefield Truck School near Peterborough as a boarder. Lakefield had a secret corps, and that was perfect for me. One of the first things I saw at Lakefield was the initials of Admiral Personnel's carved in the windowsill of the library. We also had an ancient retired Royal Navy chief there named George Lee, who had won the Distinguished Service Medal in World War I. He had sunk a German submarine by tossing a hand grenade down the conning tower. He was part of stoking my love of things naval. So were sessions at the Georgian Bay Secret Camp in summer, where I actually got to sail the Oriole. And this was before she was commissioned into the Navy. Now, here's a picture of Mark and me at the grave of an unknown sailor in an unknown Athabascan at Pluscat, when many of the Athabascans are buried, and the townspeople keep those graves in top condition. My son Mark, by the way, who was with us this evening, is the good-looking one on the right. Athabascan's wreck lies 6 miles off the Breton coast near the port of Aberwack. Here are a couple of scans of what she looks like now. Now, the hull is bashed around quite a bit because the Royal Navy had orders to depth charge wrecks to prevent lurking U-boats from taking cover next to them to avoid detection. In 2003, my son Mark was one of 5 divers to visit the wreck in 285 feet of dangerous water. At high tide springs, the current there reaches 10 knots. Some of the images are spectacular, but that can be the subject of another talk to the NSC by my son Mark. It was quite a feeling waiting for my son to come up from my father's grave to the surface. My high school friends didn't cut it with the Breton sailor manning the dive boat. However, he had a bottle of Breton wine, which we polished off, waiting almost an hour for Mark. He was decompressing on the way up. It seemed like he was down there forever, but by the time he surfaced, the Breton sailor and I were talking just like brothers. The RCN had provided us with a commemorative plaque. Mark placed it on Athabascan's keel on the port side to commemorate the 128 people who died in action. Dad's death really affected our family, and the ripple effect is felt to this day, as it is for the hundreds of thousands of Canadian families that were affected by the war. I have to give you a quick little story that meant a lot to me. There was a chief on the Athabascan by the name of Charlie Burgess. Charlie, in the initial hit, got his arm broken in 2 places, and then he got bombarded later on by burning globs of oil. But after the second hit, Charlie managed to get over the side and swim away from the ship with his good arm 75 yards, and he watched her go down. I guess he didn't think much of his chances of living. But Charlie Burgess was picked up by Haida's motor cutter. Remember, Haida dropped her motor cutter off and left it there so that they could pick up survivors. Charlie got back to the UK, and his broken arm got fixed. I knew his story, and when I was a cadet on board Antigonish in 1949, Charlie was the chief of the boat. I went to him and I explained about my dad, and I said, I don't suppose you know anything about him, do? He said, yes, as a matter of fact, I do. He was standing on the after signal deck right above where the first hit took place. He was probably blown into the water and killed instantly. And you know, that really gave me closure. Anyway, that's one of the reasons I got involved, the why in saving the Haida, because of what happened to her sister ship, the Athabascan. Thank you for indulging me. And now, the how I got involved in helping save Haida from the breakers. It goes back to the RCN's Great Lakes deployment of 1963. Haida was sent on a farewell tour. By then, I was military editor of the Old Toronto Telegram and a Naval Reserve officer at HMCS Haida. I was lucky enough to get on board Haida for a day sail out of Toronto. On board, I met Air Canada pilot Neil Bruce, lawyer and former naval officer Norm Simpson, Alan Howard, who was the curator of Toronto's Maritime Museum, and public relations specialist Dave Kidd. We got talking about what a tragedy it would be for this famous, wonderful ship to be scrapped and turned into razor blades. She deserved better, and so did Canada. We agreed to explore the possibilities. I knew Defense Minister Paul Haida quite well because of my military training, so I went directly to him and asked if we might get hold of the ship. Paul Haida said that she would be disposed of through Crown assets, but I should leave it with him. Neil Bruce made a couple of trips to Ottawa too, and he was really the spark plug behind the forming of Haida Incorporated. Anyway, remember the scrap, Haida was probably worth $500,000. That's a lot of money in 1963, far beyond what we might raise. That's nearly $5 million in today's dollars. In due time, Paul Haida worked out something which took Crown assets out of the picture. We could get the ship for $20,000 to be paid over 10 years, no interest, and the first payment deferred a year. That's about $175,000 in today's dollars. Additional conditions included that we would have to pick up the Haida in Sorel, Quebec, from the Navy. We also had to pledge to keep her in good condition so the government could have her back if needed by national defense. That was the wrinkle which allowed us to bypass Crown assets. We were in business. Norm Simpson did all the legal work pro bono, setting up Haida Incorporated, and we four all put our homes up at the bank to finance towing her from Sorrel to Sonora. $6,000 plus 2,500 for insurance. I guess it's about 65,000 today's money. I remember so well calling my wife Jane and telling her I just put the house up at the bank as collateral for the ship, but we owned 1/5 of a destroyer. There was dead silence on the phone for a few heartbeats, and then she said, "Whoopee." To which I replied, "Yeah, but remember, Aeronassus only owns a frigate." I didn't get a laugh from her either. Because we were now a chartered registered charity, we could start raising funds for this enterprise. Dave Kidd went to work on that. HMCS York agreed to a special duty for a crew of 18 reservists to go to Sorrel and pick up Haida from the Navy in mid-August. Bill Wilson, the XO, put the crew together and was agreed to take command of the ship, and he organized the whole thing. Neil Bruce and Norm Simpson with Alan Howard worked their magic for us to get permission to berth the ship at the foot of York Street in Toronto Harbor. Our reserve crew went to Montreal by train, turning the sleeper car into something that looked very much like a World War II troop train draft. Imagine us trying to convince the porter that our 120-volt generator was hand baggage. I don't think anyone of us could lift it by ourselves. We were met in Toronto by a Navy bus, which drove us to Sorrel, where Haida was waiting. The Navy had crammed her with artifacts from the Second World War: hammocks, hat boxes, dummy ammunition, and even the cutaway model of a torpedo, all things we could use in setting up displays for the public. As the only member of Haida Inc. to make the trip to Sorrel, I signed for the ship, and she was ours. Lieutenant Commander Jack McCory was our electrical officer. We tied down the generator behind B turret. Jack rigged the ship's emergency wiring, and bingo, we had power. Of course, a warship's power is 220 volts, so only the fluorescent lights work. We had a foraging party to the local supermarket to buy up a bushel of light bulbs with our regular current, and voila, we had lights. Here's a picture of our crew. That's me in the front, far left, then Jack McCory, followed by Bill Wilson, who was then our XO at York, and now from Calgary, at that time CEO of Haida, and far right, Lieutenant Bob Ellis. I was a quarterdeck officer, and Bob was the forecastle officer. With us this evening is Bill Wilson, and I'm sure that Bill found himself back 20 years ago when he was serving in HMCS Ottawa. His affiliation with the Navy goes back a long, long way. We set up half a dozen Coleman stoves in the wardroom flats, and Petty Officer Bill Lloyd became the cook, and an excellent cook he was too. We had carefully brought along some rum so we could have regular up spirits for everyone in the wardroom, and away we went. There's a picture coming up, and you'll see that on the right there, that's Bill Lloyd cooking up a storm. And on the other side is part of our crew working the lines. And remember, we had no steam, so everything had to be done by hand. It was heavy work handling those lines as we rocked through the seaway, and we saw to it that Haida didn't even scratch paint through all the locks. We all handled lines. Jack McCory had brought on a set of two-way radios, and we had given two to the tugmasters so that we could communicate with them. In true service fashion, Bill Wilson would call up the tugs with, "Tug McAllister, this is Warship Haida. Come in, McAllister." Well, these two French-Canadian tug skippers put up with us for a good half an hour, and then they turned off their radios, leaving us completely clueless. Once through the seaway locks, one of the tugs left us. I remember waking up one morning to discover we were anchored in the St. Lawrence in deep fog. We hadn't a clue where we were. Now picture Bill Wilson leaning over the rail with the SO road map as mystified pleasure boats emerged from the fog wondering what a travel class destroyer was doing in their river. Well, Bill asks, where are we? What thing happened to Bill on that? The bowl of his favorite pipe fell off into the water of the river. One of the guys saw this, ran aft, got a bucket, and actually recovered the bowl of the pipe in the bucket. Well, when this was all over, we mounted that pipe bowl on a plaque and put a stem there and tied the two of them together with a piece of chain. And we presented it to Bill. And Bill, I bet you got that in your library today. Anyway, finally the fog cleared and we proceeded to Lake Ontario. There was a west wind creating a bit of a sea, and Haida pitched the beck, almost as though she was eager to get there. We anchored off Toronto's Western Gap just as the exhibition fireworks went off. We planed with the searchlight that Jack McCrory had flashed up, and we waved to the occasional motorboat coming up to be curious. We also got ready to dress the ship for tomorrow's entry. It was a great entry next morning. As the tug took us through the Western Gap into Toronto Harbour, an armada of pleasure boats met us, horns and sirens sounding. There was also the Toronto fireboat, spewing huge arcs of water all over the place. At the York Street Jetty waiting for us were Harry DeWolf, Bob Willen, and J.R. Charles, all former CEOs of Haida, plus Defense Minister Haida and Toronto Mayor Phil Gibbons. Now, we at Haida Inc. had to sit down to business. We hired a watchman to stay on board and started getting things ready to open for the public. And there were surprises, however. More of that later. There's a little sidebar about Bob Willand, who I'm sure some of you must remember and know quite well. Bob was the last CEO of Haida during the war, and he took Haida on the last convoy run to Vermont. And when they got to that big bay just outside Vermont, the crew of the Haida decided they were going to have a pull to see how fast she would go. Wellen told me that they tied down all the safety valves and flashed her up. He claims they got the ship up to 45 knots. That's pretty damn fast for 3,000 tons. And not only that, he says the bow wave was 6 feet higher than the forecastle. Just imagine that. In early autumn 1964, HMS Britannia brought Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip to Charlottetown, PEI, to mark the centennial of the Charlottetown Conference that resulted in the creation of Canada. I was one of more than 100 news people assigned to cover the visit. Like all royal visits for news people, it was chaotic. I had a bit of an inside track because a little school acquaintance was in charge of the RCMP Marine Security Division, and they helped me a lot. When the Charlottetown part of the visit was over, Their Majesty sailed on Britannia to Quebec City. I got a berth in HMCS Terra Nova, one of the escorting destroyers. Coverage in Quebec City for journalists was a real zoo, with some compensations. There was to be a reception on Britannia for some of the news people covering the visit, and I was fortunate enough to get an invitation. It was my chance to speak to Prince Philip. I made a beeline for him right away, and I explained what we were doing with Haida. He was very interested, and then I said, Your Highness, it would be wonderful if you could become our patron. He reared back and he said, You can't ask me that sort of thing. You have to go through proper channels. And then he leaned forward and he said, And this is how you do it. Well, I followed his advice, and a couple of months later, he was our patron, which certainly made it easier to get corporate donations for Haida. In 1966, Prince Philip made a visit to Toronto. He complained that there was no time to visit the Haida scheduled for him. So his handlers gave him 15 minutes. He came and he spent almost 2 hours with us. We fed him rum in Haida's wardroom, and he climbed all over the ship, thoroughly enjoying himself. And that must have created a few challenges for his scheduling staff. 3 years after that, Philip was in Ottawa, and I met him at a receiving line at Rideau Hall. As soon as he saw me, he grabbed my arm and asked, "How's the Haida?" And I updated him. 2 years later, the same thing happened again. And when Haida was proclaimed the ceremonial flagship of the RCN, I wrote to Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace to tell him and about it, and I received a lovely letter back 2 weeks later saying that the efforts of Haida Incorporated had been vindicated. It sure wasn't all that kind of glory. The first winter we had Haida in Toronto, we discovered a serious problem. A warship with no power and fresh water in winter faces the danger of openings to the water freezing, expanding the opening, and fatally cracking the hull. That meant we had to keep bubbles coming through the water to each opening, and that meant running the pumps 24/7 in a sometimes scary attempt to keep the ship afloat. At one time, we had 5 feet of water in the engine room. We 5 Haida Inc. members were called on the middle of the night quite often. I think Dave Kidd got most of the calls. Come spring, and Norm Simpson got hold of his friend Scott Meisner, who owned Colonial Shipping and the Port Weller dry dock. Meisner said he would tow Haida to Port Weller, dry dock her, and well shut all the openings and tow her back for $20,000. Wow, what a gift! Commercially, something like that would cost at least $100,000. By 1970, things had become tight for us financially, and Haida needed some work. I was stationed in Ottawa by then and somewhat out of the loop. We discussed things, and Norm Simpson said that he thought the government of Ontario might be interested in helping. After all, Premier John Robarts was a former naval officer. At the waterfront of Toronto's Canadian National Exhibition, there was a Lancaster bomber on the pylon, a 25-pounder World War II artillery piece, a Sherman tank, another piece of WW2 artillery. Haida at Ontario Place would cement a free-service memorial. Yes, the Ontario government was interested, and they agreed to take control of Haida, assisted by friends of Haida and volunteers from HMCS Haida that Bill Wilson arranged. Haida would become the gem of Ontario Place. I remember getting a release from the bank, bank on the lien of our house, when the Ontario government got control. Haida was a major attraction at Ontario Place for more than 3 decades, until Heritage Minister responsible for Parks Canada, Sheila Cox, took it over to move it to Hamilton, where Haida is birthed today. That extremely complicated move was led by retired Navy Captain Howard Smith, who is with us tonight, and that's his story to tell. Harry Bill Wolf's son Jim also went to Lakefield with me about 10 years after me. We've since become good friends. We visited the ship together several times. A few years ago, we had a large model of Haida, custom made, which we then donated to the Lakefield School. And that model now sits just outside the school's chapel as a reminder to future generations. Lakefield has sent a couple of busloads of students to Hamilton to visit Haida already, and once the pandemic is history, there will probably be more. In early 2018, I was approached by Parks Canada in Ottawa to help with some research on some of the objects that the wrecks around Haida. And when it was announced that the RCN, she was going to be named the RCN Ceremonial flagship, I went down to the event in Ottawa with my friend Jim DeWolf. And here we are with a very interesting artifact. If you look closely at that piece of wood, you'll see the notches. Harry DeWolf carved those notches in the bridge rail with his pocket knife, one for every one of the ships that Haida was in on the sinking of. That's Gemini and Pascal holding the rail. Interesting story about that. When Haida was serving in Korea, There was a petty officer on the bridge and a young seaman charged with cleaning up the bridge. And the PO just stopped him in time because he had a power sander. He was about to clean up that historic rail. Enough to make you cry. Anyway, you might say that Haida has always been, and still is, a family affair. Because my three children, Tim, Mark, and Wendy, were all there at the flagship ceremony, as were my grandchildren. When my kids were younger, they used to climb all over Haida when she was at Ontario Place. Back to Parks Canada. They wanted to do something big and meaningful for Haida, and they organized a 3-day event. It even included having the Navy Board meet in the wardroom aboard the ship the day before the ceremony. They made special blank rounds filled with black powder for the 4-inch guns, with a gun turret turned to starboard toward New York State. They fired a volley. It was quite loud, and I'm sure the Americans across Lake Ontario thought, "My God, Canada's invading us again." There were sailors at that ceremony from 3 area reserve divisions on parade, including my own HMCS York. Parks Canada went all out. They even made the ship come alive with smoke billowing out of one of the main funnels, while a Second World War Dakota aircraft did fly past. It was simply magical, particularly when the siren sounded. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Boy, what a sound that is. Best of all, Parks Canada invited 2 hereditary chiefs of the seafaring Haida Nation. This was done to right a historical wrong. No one from the Haida Nation had ever had direct contact with their namesake ship in its 75 years of existence. The chief spoke with such pride about Haida's accomplishments, and then they gifted her their flag. It was a very moving moment when Admiral Lloyd spontaneously ordered the hoisting of the Haida Nation flag on the foremast port side yard on it. I had tears in my eyes, as did many others. Today, the Haida Nation flag still flies on the Haida as a symbol of respect. Remember the history of the Haida Nation, which once dominated North American west coast from Alaska to Southern California. Their seagoing canoes, the bows of which very much like a traveler's bow. Haida has already made its first steps toward a present-day connection with this proud indigenous nation, and that connection should be expanded and entrenched. We have much to learn from them. And speaking of emotional, there was a sunset ceremony with the Haida chiefs. Parks also lit the side of the ship with blue lights, with the Battle of the Atlantic footage projected on her hull. The names of those lost at sea during the Battle of the Atlantic scrolled up in the water and on the Haida's hull. My whole family and I gasped when we saw my father's name come up on Haida's hull. It brought everything back full circle 75 years later. They even had me ring out 4 bells, 10 o'clock, to close up the day's events. It was very, very emotional. As a country, we definitely made the right decision to save this ship. The Parks Canada staff and friends of Haida are just as passionate about telling her story as I am. She's in great hands now, and that makes me very happy. As I conclude here, I have to say something to young people about reserve service. Being a member of York really enhanced my ability to write about military things as a reporter. I was so grateful that the Toronto Telegram gave me time off for training every year. They even made up the difference in pay scale for my civilian job at the newspaper, and they did this for all reservists on their staff. Being a reservist, I got background information which helped my understanding of military issues, although I certainly couldn't write about anything confidential. Beyond that, it also gave me an appreciation for Canada's military and some of the political difficulties they face and still face today. Given that, There's no doubt in my mind that my reserve service benefited both me and my work and as a journalist and deepened my love of the Navy. I have to offer a big thank you to the Naval Association of Canada for the opportunity to share my story about the Haida. And thank you to my kids and my grandkids for being here, along with the DeWolf family. Thank you also to the Navy, Parks Canada, and the Friends of Haida. I'll take some questions now, if I can possibly answer them.
Don't leave right now. We've got something in store for you. Part two of the evening, ladies and gentlemen, what you heard this evening was truly an amazing and, in my mind, an inspirational story. Peter Ward is an unsung Canadian hero. His actions back in the 1960s in saving the Haida from the scrap heap have given all Canadians, and particularly those of us with a naval background, a special gift in the form of Haida, the RCN's ceremonial flagship. To quote Peter last Friday when we were doing a dry run of his presentation, he said, we need positive symbols in this country, and Haida is one. Truer words could not be spoken, and to me, that sums up why we are all here tonight. As such, the Naval Association of Canada, in its capacity as custodian of the Admiral's Medal, would like to recognize Peter Ward's outstanding contributions to Canada and to Canadian naval history. First, a few words about the Admiral's Medal. Established in 1985 in conjunction with the 75th
I'm not sure how far we got with Tim's audio, but certainly this, what is on the screen right now, is a representation of the Admiral's Medal. And we'd like to recognize Peter Ward, an acclaimed retired journalist, military editor, war correspondent, broadcaster, author, naval officer. We're recognizing him for his critical role in the acquisition and preservation of HMCS Haida, now a National Historical Site, and the ceremonial flagship for the Royal Canadian Navy, berthed in Hamilton, Ontario. Peter, thank you for everything that you have done for Canada. We much appreciate it, and we are pleased to award this medal to you.
Barry, thank you so much for this honor. And I have to say that I feel that I'm the only survivor of the five, and it belongs to each one of us.
You're probably
here. I guess I dropped off there, Peter, but I realized that Barry completed reading of the citation. I would now like to call upon Ray Catude to present you with the Admiral's Medal on behalf of the Naval Association of Canada. Now, this will be a virtual presentation, and indeed, it'll also be somewhat of an IOU because we haven't got the medal back from the engravers yet to present to you in hand tonight. But Ray, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. So you can't see me right now because I'm wearing a mask, but I'm standing right next to Peter. But Peter, on behalf of the Naval Association of Canada and everyone gathered here this evening, including from the Royal Canadian Navy and Parks Canada and all the friends that you have out there, we understand that you know how you feel, and this medal is a representation of accomplishment of not just yourself, but 4 other individuals that are no longer with us. But please accept this as a token of appreciation for all that you have done, not just for maritime affairs and the Navy, but also for Canada as a whole. So congratulations, thank you, and back to you, Tim. Do you want to say a couple of words, Peter?
Best country in the world, Canada, and symbols are what we need.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Peter. We've got a couple more people who would like to congratulate you. I'd now like to call on Commander Royal Canadian Navy Vice Admiral Craig Baines.
Oh,
Hello, Peter. First of all, congratulations on receiving the Admiral's Medal. I can't think of any Canadian that deserves it more in terms of recognizing your service to Canada and to the Royal Canadian Navy. Um, I don't know if you recall, but we had the pleasure of meeting in 2018 in Hamilton
Yes, I
during the
remember.
commissioning ceremony of the Haida. I remember that event with a lot of fondness. I was the commander of Maritime Forces Atlantic then, and seeing the local Indigenous chiefs there, as well as the two hereditary chiefs of the Haida Nation expressing their pride and reading poems of remembrance was very moving for all of us. And as you pointed out in your talk, my colleagues and I had our naval board on board Haida the day before the ceremony. And I can tell you, of all the naval boards I've attended, that was my favorite because it really connected the present with the past. And it was, very significant being in the shadow of giants like Harry DeWolf, who eventually became the chief of the naval staff in 1956. And none of that was lost on any of us. I have to admit, before tonight, Peter, I was always very proud to be in the Navy, but tonight you've made me even prouder. I've heard snippets of the story of saving Haida, but to hear it from you directly has been totally moving and inspiring. I have to admit, I was a bit humbled in reading your biography, Peter, that you had accomplished more before I was born than I think I have done in my whole life since. Also, not pleased that you still have a full head of hair, while, as you can see, I'm but challenged. I find it simply incredible that you put your own house at stake along with the team that saved Haida. I mean, to have that kind of dedication and just, I think, foresight that what you were doing was right and that it would pay off in the end. That's an incredible risk that you took, and I would defy anyone today to take that same type of risk. And the fact that you did it and your wife was so generous about it is simply amazing. Um, you mentioned the reserve service and how important that is. I have to tell you a quick funny story. My daughter joined the reserves this year, and I was just recently back home in Halifax visiting with my family, and I came home on Sunday night, and I got a furious text today from my daughter saying, "Dad, did you take my sea boots?" And when I went and looked in my suitcase, I had taken her sea boots. And I was thinking, wow, what a wonderful Navy where dad can steal his daughter's sea boots. Um, and that's all on reserve service. Um, I just want to acknowledge a couple other people that have joined us to celebrate you here tonight. Bill Wilson, it was great to see you online. The Harry DeWolf family, I know that you're tracking closely HMCS Harry DeWolf that has just finished sailing through the Northwest Passage and is now safely alongside in Esquimalt. What a terrific, amazing deployment that's been. First Canadian warship to do that since 1954. And just wonderful to see other members of your family online tonight, Peter. I have to admit, I was also very touched by the story of your son diving. That I don't care who you are or how much experience you have, diving 285 feet to put that plaque on Athabascan is simply incredible. And the way that you've brought the story of Athabascan and your father's sacrifice together with the Haida and what that ship did, and then saving it, it really is a beautiful, beautiful story. And the last thing I'll say as I wrap up here, Peter, is I think we need to take your story and we may need to make sure that every naval officer that goes through our Naval Officer Training Center gets to hear this story. It's inspiring. It's everything that's good about being in the Navy, and you've made me a prouder naval officer and Canadian tonight. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you so much, Admiral. I really feel that way about the Navy.
Thank you, Admiral, sir, and thank you for joining us tonight. Your words tonight very much appreciated. I would also like to ask Mr. Ron Hallman, who I mentioned earlier tonight, and I hope he's present. I haven't had a chance to actually confirm that, but Ron, if you were with us tonight, I know you have a few words of congratulations to say to Peter. So over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Tim, and hello all, and I hope you can hear me. It is a real pleasure to be here and be part of this evening to celebrate the important contributions that Peter Ward has made to saving HMCS Haida and to sharing the stories of Canada's military history with audiences across the country and around the world. What a privilege it was to hear your presentation, Mr. Ward, and what a pleasure to hear your references to Bill Wilson, who remains somewhat of a living legend for so many of us former sea cadets, sailors, and officers in the Calgary Naval community, whom I'm proud to say I've known for almost 40 years, and I'm proud to call him a friend. If I may say, Mr. Ward, your biography reads as a profile in courage and integrity. Your career in the Navy and as a journalist and your personal commitment to saving HMCS Haida present the finest examples of citizenship and of how to bring important, compelling stories of our nation to the Canadian public. You know, most Canadians are familiar with Parks Canada's work regarding national parks, but the other side of our mandate is to protect and present the 171 national historic sites that we own and manage on behalf of Canadians. And this includes HMCS Haida National Historic Site of Canada. If I may, I'd like to acknowledge briefly the branch's VP of Ops, Ray Coutu, who has spoken tonight, who is a former Parks Canada colleague and has been one of the key drivers of Parks Canada's ongoing commitment to the ship and all things naval in Canada. I can tell you that as a proud steward of the ship since 2002, Parks Canada is immensely grateful to you, Mr. Ward, to your colleagues, to the Royal Canadian Navy, and to so many friends of Haida for your efforts to save this important ship. Efforts that have made it possible for future generations of Canadians to learn about, appreciate, and learn from our nation's naval history, as told in large part through the story of HMCS Haida. And so it is my privilege to thank you on behalf of the entire Parks Canada team tonight, sir. And it is my great pleasure to confirm that we remain resolutely committed to protecting and presenting HMCS Haida and her story in honor of all those who served in her, in honor and appreciation of your efforts and so many others, and for the benefit and enjoyment of all Canadians. Thank you, sir, and congratulations.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much. More than I deserve. And I'm receiving all this on behalf of 4 other guys who are unfortunately now dead. And there were so many others who helped with Haida, not least of which was Bill Wilson. Boy, when I think of what Bill arranged for the Haida when she was at Ontario Place and how much work the people at York did with his authorization, it boggles your mind. There were so many people involved in saving this wonderful ship, and I'm privileged enough to be able to look back on it and smile. Of all the things I've done in my life, I think this was probably the most important. Thank you again.